we've got a passage from Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And I've encouraged you last Sunday, and I will encourage you today, and in a number of successive weeks. If you have a chance, sit down in your private time and just start reading from the book of Joshua. It is an inspirational book, and I think it was specifically put in the Bible for an obvious reason, but one of the reasons that I've drawn is that Joshua is really a book of unbelievable encouragement. Despite horrific odds, the children of God succeed and prevail. And I think that that's a lesson that is ripe for today's application. So the lesson today is called Arise, and it's taken from Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, right? Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them. And it occurred to me, church, that I think it's just about time to declare war on the pestilence that goes by the name I can't. Because it attacks our self-control. Maybe we say, well, I just can't resist the bottle or the drugs. It attacks our careers. I just can't keep a job. It attacks our marriages. I just can't forgive. It even attacks our faith. I can't believe that God would care for me. I can't. You know, that phrase just hangs out at really the intersections of discouragement and despair boulevards. I can't. And had Joshua mumbled those words, I'm not so sure that any of us here could have really blamed him. Because even his book begins with bad news. Joshua 1:1, after the death of Moses. It's an interesting way to start a book about a dead guy. And there was no one like Moses. You know, when the Hebrew people were enslaved, Moses confronted Pharaoh. And when the Red Sea raged ahead of them as they're fleeing Egypt, Moses prayed for help. And when the ex-slaves were hungry, or they were thirsty, or they were confused, Moses intervened, and God provided food, God provided water, and God provided the Ten Commandments. Moses meant more to the Hebrew people than Queen Victoria, Napoleon, Alexander the Great, all of them combined. I mean, even George Washington shares Mount Rushmore with 3 other presidents, doesn't he? But Moses in the Hebrew world stood alone. He was beyond compare. And to lose Moses was to lose a cause, to lose hope, to start making excuses. And yet, with the grass still yet not even grown over Moses' grave, God tells Joshua, Moses is dead, now therefore arise. Joshua 1, verse 2. And I'm thinking, in reading through this book, I don't know that I would have taken that same approach. I mean, here's my approach. Well, kids, Moses is dead. Now, therefore, we should grieve, or we should retreat, or we should reorganize now that the leader is gone, or maybe we should seek out a good therapist. That would be our response, but it wasn't Joshua's. Because God said, now, therefore, arise. And the major theme of the book of Joshua is this, that when God is involved, he changes the score. Moses may be dead, but God is alive. The leader has passed, but the leader lives on. Even so, Joshua still had a lot of reasons to say, I can't. God, I just can't do this. In fact, Joshua had at least 2 million reasons to say that he can't. Because according to the census in the book of Numbers, we know that there were 601,730 men who were aged 20 and older, not including the Levites, that was the priestly tribe, who were crossing into Jordan. We know that from the census in the Bible, the book of Numbers. So if you assume that 2/3 of these men had a wife and maybe 2 or 3 kids, you add all that up, and the people that are crossing into the Jordan under Joshua's leadership total close to 2 million people. So, Joshua's not leading a little Boy Scout troop here. He's leading 2 million people. 2 million people who are inexperienced in terms of what they're doing and where they're going. They were slaves, remember? They were told what to do. Now they've been given freedom and liberty, and they have not the foggiest notion of how to behave under that kind of freedom. They had never passed this way before. This is a group of people that is bigger than the city of San Diego. That's a lot of people. They have no experience, their leader is dead, and they don't know what to do. They could fight snakes, and they could fight lizards and leopards and windstorms, but breach the walls of Jericho? Are you kidding me? Wage war on bloodthirsty barbarians? These folks that were across the river with names like the Perizzites and the Hittites and the Canaanites and the Amorites. And those are just really odd names to us. But to the Hebrew people at that time, it struck fear in the hearts of the Hebrew people. Because the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Canaanites, and the Amorites were tribes of just pure evil. If you think ISIS is bad, that's probably the best comparison that I can give you in talking about these groups of people that the Hebrews were going to have to confront. These people sacrificed babies for worship. They had orgies in the city to their gods. They dedicated themselves to witchcraft and idolatry. They were ruthlessly devoted to using the most innocent and vulnerable members of their community, like babies and virgins, to manipulate God or their gods for their gain. That's who these people are. But fortunately, Joshua never declared defeat. And before Joshua could even start to assemble any fears in his mind about God saying, you know what, get up, arise, and go, God now gives him a reason to have faith. Arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving them. Joshua 1, verse 2. Not the land that I might give you, not the land that you must conquer, not the land in which you must prove yourself worthy before I give it to you, not the land where you must earn it or confiscate it or conquer it, but the land which I am giving to them. In other words, church, the transaction had already been completed. The land had already been transferred. The conquest was a fait accompli. It was already in the books. Joshua wasn't sent to take the land. He was sent to receive the land that God had given. Victory was certain because the victory was God. And I want you to ponder on that for just a moment. Joshua was not sent with 2 million people to take the land. Joshua was sent to receive the land that God had given. Are there perhaps some analogies in your own life where you are afraid to arise and go because you think you have to conquer it or you have to be worthy to receive it? When God has already gained the victory, and it's your job to receive it, not to take it. The Hebrews had a new land because their father had declared so. And about the time that Joshua was lifting his jaw off the ground, like, are you kidding me? You're giving us this land? God then explains the dimensions of the gift that he's giving to them. Here's what he says. Joshua chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and the great sea toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. That's a big area. That's like 10 million square miles. It's a huge area. And keep in mind that the Hebrew people are gypsies. They're ex-slaves. They don't have a place to lay their head. They didn't even own a sandlot. And now, in one grand divine fiat, they are given the land of their dreams. And in one of Israel's finest moments, Joshua said yes. He said yes to his inheritance. And the word inheritance is in the book of Joshua like Starbucks is in your neighborhood. It's just like everywhere, right? You cannot not find a Starbucks. And you cannot not find the word inheritance in Joshua. The word appears nearly 60 times. The command to possess the land is seen on 5 separate occasions. The great accomplishment of the Hebrew people came down to this. And this is summarized in Joshua chapter 24 now, verse 28. So Joshua let the people depart, each to his own inheritance. And I'm thinking, isn't it time for you to receive yours too? Isn't it time for you to receive your inheritance too? You have one. We've been talking about it. If you've given your life to Christ, God has given Canaan to you. He has blessed you with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places in Christ. That's what Paul told the church in Ephesus, chapter 1, verse 3. And note the tense. He has blessed, not he will bless, not he might bless, not someday he could possibly bless. The promised land property was put in your name already. The clerk's office in heaven has already recorded the deed. It's done. You already have everything that you need to be everything that God desires you to be. You have access to every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. And that promise, church, might very well be the best kept secret in all of Christendom. We underestimate what happened to us upon our conversion. Because as one writer Riley observed, many Christians view their conversion as something like a car wash. You go in a filthy clunker, you come out with your sins washed away, a cleansed clunker. So you were dirty, now you're clean, but you're still a clunker. And a lot of people view their conversion the same way. okay, well, I was a sinner. Now I've been cleansed of my sin, but I'm still this messed up person I was before I received Jesus, before I was baptized. I came out of the water and I don't feel any different. I'm not levitating. I'm not wearing a halo. And we all believe somehow in some way that this conversion is not really anything important, when it really is everything. But conversion is more than just the removal of our sin. It's a deposit of power. It's as if your high mileage, 4-cylinder engine was extracted and a brand new Ferrari engine was mounted in your spiritual frame. God removed the old motor that was in you, that was caked and cracked and broken with rebellion and sin, and replaced it with a humming, roaring version of himself. See, your best days, church, begin with a paradigm shift. Paradigm shift. Fundamental change in an individual's or a society's view of how things work in the world. Your best days begin with that kind of a shift. Because in Canaan, you do not fight for victory. You fight from victory. You see the distinction? You're not fighting to win. You're fighting because you already did. In the wilderness, you strive, but in Canaan, you trust. In the wilderness, you seek God's attention. In Canaan, you already have God's favor. In the wilderness, you doubt your salvation, and in Canaan, you know you're saved. You move from wanting to have to believing you already do. When you were born into Christ, you were placed in God's royal family. John writes in John chapter 1, verse 12, "As many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God." So since you are already part of that family, you have access to the family's blessings. All of them. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11 says, "In him also we have obtained an inheritance." Does that surprise you? I mean, did you know that you have this inheritance? Have you really thought about what you've been given? The Apostle Paul describes the value of your portfolio in Romans chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. Here's what he says: "The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then what? Heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ." We are joint heirs with Christ. Joint. That's like equal. I mean, we're in this together. In fact, the Greek term that's used in this passage is sukleronomos. Sug meaning together, and kleronomos meaning inheritance. An inheritance together, a together inheritance. However you want to put it together, it's together. You get it. We share the same inheritance as Jesus Christ. Our portion isn't a pittance. We don't inherit just the leftovers. We don't wear hand-me-downs. We aren't standing out in the cold with some distant cousins. Because 1 John chapter 4, verse 17 says, "Our standing in the world is identical with Christ's." Christ's portion is our portion. Whatever he has, we have. Okay, but if all that's true, then how in the world do you explain this disconnect? It's like, okay, you're telling me about this inheritance, but I don't feel like I hit the lottery here. I mean, why do I not understand this? If we're co-heirs with Christ, then why do we have these struggles in life? Our inheritance is perfect peace, but we feel like a perfect mess. God promises to meet every need, yet we still worry. Why is that? I'm glad you asked. I have at least two suggestions as to possibly why that is. The first is maybe you don't know about your inheritance, and now that's no longer true. You've heard it. No one ever told you about the exceeding greatness of His power toward us who believe. Apparently, the church in Ephesus was dealing with this same issue, because that's from Ephesians chapter 1, verse 19. He was persuading the church there in Ephesus, don't you understand the exceeding greatness of His power toward all of us who believe? He's trying to encourage this church who's struggling apparently with the same disconnects that we do. No one ever told us, perhaps, that we fight from victory, not for it. Maybe no one told us that this land has already been conquered. Some Christians never live out their inheritance because they don't even know they have one. That doesn't apply to you now because you do. Now, you know that you were made for more than this wilderness wandering. God saved you from Egypt so that He could bless you in the promised land. I find it really curious in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 23, that Moses had to remind the people of something. And here's what he said: God brought us out from there that He might bring us into Canaan. And I think that leads to a possible second reason for the disconnect. God brought us out so He could lead us in. He set us free so that He could raise us up. The gift has been given, but the question is, will you trust it? And that leads to the second reason. Because depending upon your answer, will you trust, that may be the second reason for the disconnect. We just don't believe in our inheritance. That was the problem of Joshua's ancestors. They didn't really believe that God could give them the land. The best days of the Hebrews could have begun, a point that even God alluded to in His promise to Joshua. Joshua chapter 1, verse 3. Listen to this. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I said to Moses. I think God was just giving Joshua a reminder. Hello, kid. Remember? I made this offer to the people of Moses' day. That was like 40 years ago. But they didn't take it. They chose to live in the desert. Joshua, don't make the same mistake. Unfortunately, Joshua didn't. Much to his credit, he took God at His word and set about the task of inheriting the land. So, church, do the same. Receive your inheritance. You are embedded with the presence of God. Don't measure your life by your ability. Measure it by God's. Even though you can't forgive, perhaps, God can. And since God can, you can too. You can't break that habit, perhaps, but God can. And because God can, you can too. Maybe you can't control your temper or your tongue or your sexual urges, whatever. But God can, and since He can, you can too. You have access to every blessing of heaven. And as a result, in time, you will find that strength. Your best days, church, are for the taking. They await you. Your inheritance is there. Make the mental shift from the wilderness that we live in from day to day, it seems, to now living in Canaan. The wilderness mentality says, I'm weak. I will always be weak. I can't. Canaan people say, I was weak, but I'm getting stronger. Wilderness people say, I'm a victim of my environment. Promised Land people say, I'm a victor in spite of my environment. Wilderness people say, these days are really hard. They're really difficult. I'll never get through them. And God's people will say, these days are my best days. God will get me through. Imagine, just imagine, what would happen if an entire generation, one generation of Christians, actually lived out of their inheritance? Men and women would turn off internet porn. The lonely would find comfort in God, not in the arms of strangers. Struggling couples would spend more time in prayer and less time in anger. Children would consider it a blessing to care for their aging parents. A generation of Christians would vacate the wilderness. And here's why: because God's power is very great for us who believe. That power, church, is the same as the great strength God used to raise Jesus Christ from the dead. Ephesians chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Do you kind of get the fact that maybe this church in Ephesus was struggling maybe with the same issue? I do. Because what Paul is trying to tell that church and us today is that that same steely, burly force that raised Jesus Christ from the dead will turn every I can't into an I can. Paul, writing to the church in Philippi, chapter 4, verse 13, says, I can do all things through Christ, who strengthens me. Church, if you will just think about it, a new day awaits you every day. A new season of accomplishment, or a new season of discovery, or even a new season of strength and hope awaits you. And my encouragement to you this Sunday is leave your I can'ts behind you. Set your God can ahead of you, and then get ready to cross the Jordan. And that's why God told Joshua, Moses is dead, now therefore arise. Out of the Hebrews' abject sadness that their leader is gone, the assistant of Moses, leading probably 2 million people or more from a background of slavery into a promised land that had been given to them, God says, Joshua, arise. And I think, church, he tells us the same thing today. Church, arise. You've been given an inheritance. It awaits your taking. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to be perfect to get it. All you have to do is lay hold of it. And the only way to do that is to take the first step, or to arise. So, funny thing, we picked a song, I picked a song. This is the Imperial We, I do the song list, I guess, but Soldiers of Christ Arise. I mean, doesn't that make sense? I want you all to stand up and sing this song that Steve is going to lead us. And I want you, as you sing this song, think about the promise and the inheritance that God has given you and the encouragement to soldier up and arise. Let's stand, please.